angels our Redeemer brought, the King who held the stars, lay helpless in the maiden's arms and pressed against her heart.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to this very special SIM webinar live from Green Island Baptist Church. My name is April, and I'll be guiding you through the process this evening. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us for Coronavirus at Christmas, Where is God? We're looking forward to hearing from David Glass, who will be presenting on this topic and then answering your questions a little later on. This webinar format is different to normal SIM. You can see us, but we can't see you. In fact, we're standing in this big room and we feel like we're talking to ourselves. But never fear, there are ways for you to interact with us, and let me talk you through some of them now. So on your SIM screen, either at the top or at the bottom, there is a chat box. Feel free to type in a hello and let us know what part of the country you're joining us from, and we'll maybe even give you a shout out. There's also a question and answer option. So later on, David will take some time to field your questions. Please do submit your questions throughout the evening at any time during the event. In fact, it'll be really helpful if you start to submit them even now, and you can type in any questions that you have, and then that means we can get through as many of them as possible. Thank you, Phil Howe, for a shout out from Carrick Fergus, and there's Louise Kerr as well. It's great to have you guys with us. Finally, then, we're going to be running some polls during the evening, which will allow you to get involved and allow us to hear from you on a few questions that we have. I'm going to do a couple of test ones now to make sure it's working. So let me pull up the first poll and you can see what it's like. Just to let you know, all votes are anonymous, so you can vote as honestly as you would like. So our first poll is, how did you hear about this event? And we'll give you about 30 seconds or so to vote. How did you hear about this event? Did you hear about it at Green Island Baptist, maybe at one of our services or through watching online? Maybe you looked on social media and found out about it. You might have come across it on our website or word of mouth, or maybe some other way you found out about it. So take time to vote for that question, and we will show the results in about 10 seconds. What will win? Let's see. Through Green Island Baptist, popular one, very good. Social media, not bad. Maybe need to up my game there. And word of mouth, it's great to know that your family and friends have invited you along. That's went good. Let me try another one. Just want to definitely make sure it's working. So we want to ask you how many people are joining from your device. So you might be watching alone, or you might be watching with people, hopefully in your bubble. So how many people are joining in from your device? One person, two people, or three or more people? Have a wee vote there and let us know how many people you're joining in with. Just going to look at some of the chat options while I do that. Someone's joining from France. That's amazing. Bonjour. Apologise for my French accent. Johnny McGreevy's laughing over here. Can we get the results of that poll up? There we go. Okay, one's popular, two's behind it, and a few people watching, three or more, all very safely keeping into their bubbles and social distancing. Well, now that we know that that's working, I'm going to hand over to Johnny, who will give us an introduction to tonight's event and tell us what will happen. Johnny.
Thanks very much, April. It's good that she told us how tonight works. Anybody that knows me knows that I wouldn't have been very good at that particular part. But I do want to explain a wee bit about who we are. Myself and April work here at Green Island Baptist. We're a local church, and basically our heart is to love God and love people. We believe that God has given us a life-giving message of hope, and we want to share that message with people in our community. That's why we're willing to do new and innovative and kind of uncomfortable things like this tonight, because we really want to dialogue with people. We want to engage with you about the claims of the Bible, about who Jesus is, and about his power and relevance for people like you and me living in a world like the world we're living in, not least a world that's been somewhat turned upside down this year with the current pandemic, when really many of the things that we depend upon for regular life have been exposed for their fragility, their weakness, and we find ourselves asking some big questions about our purpose and our meaning. And we believe that God is very much in the midst of what's happening in the world right now, that he's not absent, he's not unfeeling, he's certainly not silent. Right now, I'm going to continue on with the polls, and through these polls, I want you to give us a bit of a sense of who you are or how you're arriving at this conversation tonight about coronavirus and God. So I'll put out the two questions, and these questions just help us understand kind of what lens you're considering this whole conversation through. The first question is a multiple choice question. How has COVID-19 pandemic affected you? There's a bunch of answers here. Answer one, I or someone I know has contracted COVID. Two, I've lost someone to COVID. Three, I've experienced separation from loved ones. Four, I've experienced feelings of loneliness or isolation. Five, I've experienced feelings of anxiety and fear. Six, I've faced job uncertainty or financial insecurity. Or seven, I don't feel that it has affected me at all. I'll just give you a moment just to pick one of those and to vote accordingly, and we'll share the result of this poll and the next one after David has spoken. Now, without seeking to skew the results of that poll, I'm guessing that in one way, shape, or form, we've all been affected by COVID-19, perhaps, hopefully not through loss or personal tragedy, but even through simple things like interruption to our plans and routine or restriction of our liberties. I guess none of us, as we come to this conversation tonight, is kind of standing on the outside looking in at this thing called COVID-19. It has affected each one of us. The second poll that I want to throw out there tonight is a bigger poll, but simple answer, yes or no. Do you believe in the existence of God? Do you believe in the existence of God? I'll give you a second or two to answer that one. With respect to this poll, I'm conscious that actually that question probably raises more questions, like what do we mean by God? Are we talking there about a force or a feeling or a person? What do we mean by believe? Or are we saying that we tick a box intellectually? Or are we talking about the kind of faith that requires commitment and translates into life choices? I guess this is where maybe we need to be honest about who we are as a church as we come to this conversation tonight. You've shared a wee bit through those answers about who you are and how you're arriving here. But we're very much coming to this conversation tonight through a faith perspective. We're speaking about a God who's alive and active in the world, a God who we believe has revealed himself in real time and space in the person of Jesus, and who continues to communicate with us today through his word and by his Spirit. In saying that, let me be clear, you don't have to be a Christian to engage in this discussion with us tonight, and there's no assumed Bible knowledge required here either. You also don't need to agree with what I've just said about who God is, about Jesus, or what he means with respect to our world. But I believe that we do need to say to you that we're coming to this whole question of coronavirus from a Christian perspective. And what I mean by that is the Bible is the lens through which we're trying to make sense of this present crisis and the challenges it throws up and the possible lessons we could learn from it. We're fully aware that you may be with us tonight wearing a very different set of glasses, looking at life through a different perspective, or even an opposing perspective or set of values from our own. That is perfectly okay. We are more than happy that you've joined with us tonight. And we hope and pray that you'll find tonight helpful and engaging. Let me also be very careful to say that tonight through this discussion, we're not trying to proof text any pain that you might have dealt with through this crisis. And we're also not trying to use this crisis as a way of kind of scoring points for our way of thinking, not at all. We're simply coming with the belief that God is at work in this world, that he has something to say in the midst of all the things we've been going through individually and corporately. So that's a wee bit about who you are, how you're coming to this, who we are, and how we're coming to this. Let me finally just introduce our speaker, Dr. David Glass. David is married to Kathy. They've got 6 kids and live here in Green Island. They're our neighbours. David is a senior lecturer at the School of Computing at the University of Ulster, and has recently been involved in doing some work on COVID-19, particularly in mathematical models that have helped with the present lockdown and second wave. David is also the author of Atheism's New Clothes. He writes for the apologetics website Saints and Skeptics, and has a particular interest in the relationship between science and Christianity, and in how evidence should be used in debates about the existence of God. Just before I hand over to David, let's just briefly pray for him. Father, we just thank you for the opportunity to gather together tonight from all arts and parts. Lord, we come to this discussion with different experiences, different struggles, maybe looking at it through different lenses. But God, we pray just would you guide and help and equip and use David tonight as he shares of his expertise, shares of his own heart and his own convictions, what you've done in his life. Just be with us, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, Johnny and April, for the introductions. And it really is great to be with you here, albeit in a strange environment this evening as we do this online. But 2020 has been a very strange year, hasn't it? I mean, here we are approaching Christmas, and yet we're in lockdown. So we can't meet together this evening in the church building. We can't meet up with friends. We can't go for coffee. We can't even go shopping. And I mean, at this time of year and the run up to Christmas, isn't that what we would all be doing? Although I have to admit, I don't like shopping at the best of times. So actually having an excuse not to go shopping is one positive thing for me anyway. But here we are tonight, as April mentioned earlier, in an empty church. And so this is a strange experience, speaking to an empty auditorium in front of me and looking at a camera, and also being aware that you're sitting looking at a computer screen at home. And so that puts a little bit of extra pressure on me, because I realize you can get up and just go off and make yourself a cup of tea whenever you feel like it. So I will do my best to try to keep your attention. Who would have guessed that a year ago, when we go back to Christmas last year, that the world could have changed so much? And it has just changed in unimaginable ways. The impact of COVID-19 has been enormous. It's estimated that there are 68 million cases or more of COVID-19 over the last year, and over 1.5 million deaths. I mean, it's just incredible when you stop to think about those statistics. It's really quite frightening. Healthcare systems have been stretched to breaking point. And never mind the sort of ongoing consequences when you think of the indirect impact through mental illness and the reduced treatment of other conditions. It really has been devastating in all sorts of ways, including for the economy and society. The economists tell us that it's the worst recession since the Great Depression. And it's estimated that between April and June this year, somewhere in the region of the equivalent of 400 million full-time jobs were lost. So at all sorts of levels, the devastation has been huge. But there is a vaccine, so there is hope here. And we're just at the initial stages of the rollout of this vaccine. So this is encouraging, this is exciting to see. At the same time, though, we're not out of the woods yet. This is going to take time, and especially in the run-up to Christmas now, with the restrictions being relaxed, there's still work to be done before we're in the clear. Still, there is some basis for hope that we will see light at the end of this very dark tunnel. But what I want to do tonight is to just give us an opportunity to reflect on this and some of the questions it raises. I mean, I don't know how you've been affected by it. We'll find out from the poll later. Perhaps you or a loved one has had a serious case of COVID-19, or perhaps you've lost a loved one as a result of it. Perhaps you've been isolated. Perhaps you're currently isolated and you're not able to see people. Perhaps you've been isolated for a long time and haven't been able to see people for ages, or at periods during this year, perhaps for months on end. Perhaps you've lost your job or your business has been badly affected. Perhaps you don't fall into any of those categories. I mean, I haven't been particularly badly affected myself in any of those more serious ways. But still, we've all been affected at some level, haven't we, by the upheaval of it all? Whether that's working from home, trying to balance work and family life, and just the uncertainty of it all. Perhaps you'd great hopes for 2020 and you faced the disappointment that those just haven't been realized. So it raises all sorts of questions. I think one of the biggest ones for me is the fact that there are just so many things that we took for granted. Go back a year to last Christmas, just all the things that we took for granted. And yet, especially when we think back to that first lockdown, they were just gone. Many of our freedoms disappeared. So we weren't in control of our lives in the same way anymore. I mean, it wasn't that there was a totalitarian state restricting our freedom. It was an invisible virus. And so we were vulnerable to this new enemy in our midst. So this vulnerability in all of life, I think, is something that has probably impacted upon all of us. And so it raises all kinds of questions, and perhaps in particular, a question that a lot of people ask is, where is God in all of this? Why has God allowed this? And of course, this is not a new question. It's an instance of what is called the problem of evil, or the problem of suffering. And this is perhaps the greatest challenge to belief in God of all the challenges that might be presented. And we all, I think, feel this challenge at some level. So what I want to do tonight, just before we get into the details of this, is to distinguish between two versions of the problem of evil. One is what philosophers call the intellectual problem of evil, and the other is the emotional problem. So the intellectual question or problem is raising a question over God's existence, and we'll look at that shortly. But the emotional one is concerned with how we comfort and how we help someone who is experiencing suffering. And that's a very different question, isn't it? Because when you're experiencing suffering, you don't necessarily need an intellectual answer. In fact, that might be the very last thing that you want. So I don't know where everybody's coming from tonight, but let me just outline where I want to go with this. I want to start by looking at this intellectual question. And if you're coming from the perspective of your own experience, I just want to ask you to bear with me on this, because I think this is important just to set a little bit of context before we move on to something that will hopefully be more helpful, if you like. And the gist of this is that I think this first part of the talk, in terms of looking at intellectual responses, only gets us so far. And we're probably going to end up a bit dissatisfied. That's not a great ad for the rest of my talk. But anyway, let's see how we go with that. So starting off with the problem of evil. This is an age-old question. David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, discussed it, but he referred back to the early Greek philosopher Epicurus. And of course, it was written about before that as well. We go back into the Old Testament and we read the book of Job that addresses this question of the problem of suffering. So one way of putting the problem in terms of the intellectual challenge to believers in God is to say that a good God would want to avoid evil, would want a world without evil. And an all-powerful God would be able to prevent it. Yet there is evil in the world. That's clearly evident. I mean, I don't think I need to argue for the truth of that claim. But then the question is, how can there be a God? Where does God fit into this picture? If a good and all-powerful God would want to avoid evil and would be able to, where then is God? Now, as I said, this is an age-old question, and I can't possibly do justice to this topic tonight, but I just want to set the scene a little bit. Because not only is it an age-old question, but it's one that's been written about a lot by Christians and other religious thinkers and by atheists as well over the last 60 years or so. And so what I want to do is just very, very briefly give you a little bit of a flavor of this. So we also have on the slide here a philosopher called Alvin Plantinga, and we'll come across him later on as well. But he has written a lot about the problem of evil. And one of the things that you might imagine is that this is just a question that there's just no conceivable answers to. And at some level, that is perhaps right. But I do want to just say a little bit about this, because one of the interesting things is that in all of these recent debates, there has been perhaps some degree of agreement on one point: that God could have reasons for allowing at least some evil and suffering. In other words, the very existence of evil does not absolutely rule out the existence of God. So Plantinga, for example, has written a lot about the value of human freedom. So God could certainly create a world without evil. He is powerful enough to do that. There would be no difficulty. But the difficulty from our point of view would be that it would be a world without humans. It would be a world of robots who were always guaranteed to do the right thing. And so his response is basically to say that if God creates a world with people who have freedom and responsibility, people who have the opportunity to choose love, to choose God, or to choose not to love, or to choose evil, then there is no guarantee that we will have a world without evil. Now, of course, you might ask, well, how much does this really explain? That might account for some of the things that humans do. But people would then extend this further, and I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but we might ask what kind of a world God would want to create. I mean, would God, for example, create a world where suffering just wasn't possible? And so the question might be, well, what kind of a world would it be? God would want to create a world, some people have argued, where there would be consequences to our actions, where God wouldn't intervene all the time. So, for example, could God create a world where fire didn't burn? I mean, it's a simple example, but it highlights the point. Fire can be useful for positive purposes, but there's also a negative side to it. The same is true with water, for example, as well. So what sort of a world do we live in, and what might the consequences of our actions be, so that we can learn from this world and learn how to live in this world, learn how to treat people beneficially rather than harmfully? But again, this seems limited, doesn't it? And many others have pointed to the terrible examples of evil and suffering that exist in our world. Surely these kinds of answers don't really explain them. And I think somebody like Plantinga would agree, no, they don't. And we'll see that later on. But does this show that there is no God, or that there is evidence against God? Well, again, one of the things that people have said here is that we are limited as human beings. And it's entirely possible that God has morally good reason for allowing the suffering that we see in the world. Or at least we as limited human beings are simply not in a position to know that God doesn't have reasons for allowing it. I wonder how you react to that. Probably like me, that's all a bit limited, isn't it? It seems dissatisfying. And here I think it's useful to distinguish between two types of evil: moral and natural evil. So moral evil is evil that's brought about by humans. Natural, we could think here of natural disasters, and that's what I want to turn to. How might we try, or how have Christians tried to make sense of natural disasters? Well, anytime there's a natural disaster, one of the things that you can be sure of is that some Christian somewhere will attribute it to God's judgment. It's because some particular group of people have acted in a sinful way and God is judging that group of people. Now, in response to this, I don't think this is an adequate response at all. Because I think there are a couple of reasons here. It's not that God doesn't judge. I mean, as Christians, when we read the Bible, we find that God does judge. In fact, when we read the Old Testament, we read prophets like Isaiah, who do attribute various things that have happened in human history to God's judgment. But that's just the point, isn't it? It was prophets to whom God had revealed that this was his judgment. And I just don't think we have any corresponding revelation today that COVID-19 or other natural disasters are God's judgment. The second reason for rejecting this response is that Jesus was asked about natural disasters. He was asked about 18 people who had died when a tower fell on them, or about a man who was born blind. Was this because of their sin, because of their wrongdoing? Jesus said, no, that wasn't the explanation that Jesus gave. In fact, he didn't give one. Interestingly, in one of those cases, he did say that God would eventually judge and that people needed to change their ways. So God's judgment will come, but we also need to remember that God is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in love. A God who relents from sending calamity and gives us every opportunity to change our ways. So from a biblical point of view, I think this first one is just not the right approach. Another one that people will appeal to is to say that it's just a consequence of life in a fallen world. According to the biblical account, humans have rebelled against God. We have turned away from God. And so there have been consequences of that. Consequences of living in this world where we have rejected God. Now, according to this response, it's suffering and natural disasters are not a direct response of a particular group of people suffering, but it's more indirect than that. It's a result of our rebellion in general, and that there are consequences of it. Now, it does seem to me that this has got to be part of a Christian answer, but it's on its own, I don't think it really addresses the question fully. And here's why. It just pushes it back one stage further. It leaves us with a question, well, why did God introduce natural disasters as a consequence of human sinfulness? Now, I'm not saying there aren't answers to that, but it does leave that question and just pushes it one stage further back. So it's not a fully satisfactory answer, but I think it does get something really important right. And that is that there's something wrong with the world. The world is not the way it's supposed to be. And I think whatever our perspective on all of this, whatever our worldview, I think when we look at COVID-19, I think we kind of understand this to some extent. That this is just not the way things are supposed to be. Something does appear to have gone wrong. Well, let's look at another response that some Christians would give. They would say, well, when it comes to natural disasters, and so here we're thinking of not only COVID-19, but things like earthquakes and volcanoes and so forth. They would say, well, this is part of God's creation. Earthquakes, for example, are not themselves evil. In fact, one of the interesting things is that as scientists have looked more into the role that earthquakes and volcanoes have, they've discovered that, looking at plate tectonics, that these are very important for regulating the climate and for releasing nutrients into the soil and in other ways that basically support life on Earth. And you see, an earthquake, it's just an event. It's not good or evil. I mean, of course, it can lead to terrible consequences in certain circumstances, but an earthquake is not evil in and of itself. But how does that apply to viruses? Surely it doesn't apply to viruses. Well, interestingly, in recent years, scientists have looked a lot at different types of viruses. And what they've discovered, surprisingly, certainly to me anyway, is just how critical life is to viruses. For example, for controlling bacteria populations to give us balanced ecologies. Here's what one scientist says about viruses: that if all viruses suddenly disappeared, the world would be a wonderful place for about a day and a half, and then we'd all die. And it turns out that the vast majority of viruses are beneficial for human life. Indeed, we as humans depend on them. Apparently, we have got what's called a microbiome. It's all these bacteria and microbes that live on us and within us, particularly in our guts. And this includes bacteria, but it also includes viruses. And these are needed for healthy living. So actually, viruses are not all bad, strangely. They're also needed for production of oxygen. The microbes in the oceans produce 50% or so, or thereabouts anyway, of the Earth's oxygen. And yet without viruses, that would be seriously affected. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that COVID-19, the COVID virus, is therefore good? Well, no, and I don't think this answer, I think this one is worth pursuing. There's something to it. But again, it's only part of the answer, isn't it, at best? Because I don't think this approach really captures that the devastation brought about by earthquakes or viruses wasn't part of God's plan. That, as we talked about earlier, things aren't supposed to be this way. So where does all of this leave us? Well, it leaves me a bit like I feel when I'm trying to do a jigsaw with my children. And I don't know if you've ever sat down to do a jigsaw and you've got hundreds of pieces and you try to put them all together and there are so many blue for the sky that you just don't know where to start. And you all work together and eventually you get one or two together and you're not even sure really whether all the pieces are in the box and whether this is going to work. But eventually you get a few bits and pieces together and at least at the outside, at the edges, you begin to get the idea that maybe, just maybe, this is going to work out. So little bits fall into place, but you're still not satisfied because you know this is going to take forever to get the full picture. And it does seem to me that the sort of things we've been talking about so far at best are giving us little bits of the jigsaw. That yes, maybe there is an answer. Perhaps some combination of these second and third answers will tell us something. But what I want to do for the rest of our time is now to say, well, if that's as far as we can get, maybe we can take a different approach. And so the question I'd like to ask is whether we can trust God in the face of suffering and evil. Not whether we can explain it. I think we've established that we can't do that. But can we trust that somehow God is in control? And this is where I want to look at the relevance of Christmas. So what is Christmas all about? Well, at this time of the year, and for many people, it can involve all sorts of things. In particular, indulgence. Eating far too much food and drinking too much and watching too many movies on Netflix or whatever, maybe not yet, but in a couple of weeks' time, and too much shopping and too much expenditure and all of those things. For me, Christmas also involves too much DIY. All the DIY jobs that I didn't get done during the year, we suddenly decide the weekend before Christmas that we need to get them done before the relatives come around. And so I get out and start doing my DIY, and I'm relieved to see Christmas Day because at least on Christmas Eve, I have put away whatever tools I was using. And since I live in Green Island, if anybody's really big into their DIY, do feel free to call around on Christmas Eve. You'd be more than welcome. Social distancing permitted, of course, or still in place. So those are some of the things that, of course, Christmas might be about for us. But of course, there's also a spiritual gloss, isn't there? Maybe we get along to a carol service and we hear these nice carols and a heartwarming story. And if we have time and all the busyness to think about it for 5 minutes, maybe we get some moral from the story. A moral of kindness, of peace, and that's all good. But what I want to say is that there is more. And more that is almost obvious to many of us living in this part of the world, but would have come as a huge shock to Jews in the first century. And this is the idea that God has become one of us. He has come into our world and he shares in our suffering. In John's Gospel, the writer says that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. What they were declaring was that none other than God himself had come to live in our world. One version of this is to say that God became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. Imagine God moving into Green Island. That's what it was like for these early Christians. That's what they were claiming, that God had actually himself lived there as a human being. Now, you might say, well, other people believe this sort of thing. The Romans did this with their emperors. They voted to elevate their emperors to the status of deity. But that was different because they believed in multiple gods. The Jews didn't. The Jews believed in one God, the creator of heaven and earth. And it was blasphemous to think that this one God could become a human being. But that's what the early Christians proclaimed. And so God is not remote. Emmanuel. God is with us, and he is shared in our suffering. So the first thing that I want to suggest then is that because of Christmas, we can trust God. Now, earlier I mentioned the limitations of our knowledge. And because of our knowledge, we may not be able to understand God's reasons for allowing suffering, but can we trust God? Now, trust is very important. It's been very important in the context of COVID-19. Do we trust the scientists and the advice they're giving the government? Do we trust the government to make the right choices and so forth? How should we live in the light of all that's been going on? Who should we trust? So it's a very important topic, and it's very important in our own lives. So I don't know if you've ever brought a child to the dentist, and the child is too young to understand what the dentist is doing, and perhaps they need an injection. And the child just cannot comprehend what this is about. Why would my parents let this happen to me? But if they trust the parents, maybe they can go through with this, even though they don't understand why. One of my children, we didn't even need to go to the dentist. It was just going to the hairdressers. And actually, it struck me as quite rational when he saw somebody coming at him with a pair of scissors. He got up, jumped off the chair, and ran out. So I'm not sure how much he trusted his parents, but the point is clear. The children have this ability to trust even when they don't understand. And so my question then is, can we trust God? And when we look at what God has done, that he has come into our world and shared in the worst of suffering, then I think, yes, we can trust God. Secondly, I think we can trust God because God is able to bring great good out of great evil. And when we look at the life of Jesus, we see this. He not only comes and lives as a human being, just like you or me, but he experiences the very worst that this world has to offer and suffers the most horrendous death. And so out of this horrendous suffering and evil, God brings great good, arguably the greatest good that the world has ever seen. This incredible demonstration of God's sacrificial love for us. And of course, at a human level, we can see this in other cases too. We have seen it in the context of COVID. The examples of self-sacrifice of those on the front line, the incredible efforts of those working to develop vaccines and coming together for the common good, a change in people's priorities, all of these good things that have come out of evil. But could it be that God is able to bring something even greater out of this? Well, C.S. Lewis once said that we can ignore even pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasure, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Now, I want to be careful here. My point is not that suffering is good, but rather that God can bring good out of it, out of great evil. And in fact, this is a story of Christianity. The incarnation, this idea that God becomes a human being, also raises a further question for us concerning God's purposes in our world. You see, when Jesus came, he didn't bring an end to suffering there and then. And we might have expected him to. We might have thought, well, that's what God should do. A good God would be able to prevent suffering and would want to. So if God came into the world, isn't that what he would do? And yet that's not what happened. At least not straight away. But of course, God was doing something else. And Christians believe he was doing something much greater. That in coming into the world, God was putting things right again. He had a purpose that was much greater than just getting rid of suffering. Now, I want to be careful here. I don't want to minimize in any way the extent of suffering. But what is God's purpose? What is it? What's his priority for human beings? And I would say that God's priority, his purpose for us, is something that we can't fully comprehend. It's that we can come to know God himself. God who is the source of everything good, of love, of truth, of beauty, of justice, of forgiveness, of mercy. Everything good that we can think of, God is the source of that, and he wants to bring us into a loving relationship with himself. And I would say that that is God's priority. So if we think that God's priority would be just our happiness, then maybe we would see this as a real problem, the problem of evil. But maybe when we think of God's purposes, God is bringing about something, even through something as terrible as COVID-19, that in a world like ours, it may be the case that if we had everything we wanted, if we had a pain-free, happy existence where we could do whatever we liked and there were no consequences, that we would miss the very purpose for which we were made, and that we would ignore God because we didn't need him. Reflecting on all of these sorts of considerations, Alvin Plantinga, whom I mentioned earlier, who has written a huge amount about this intellectual problem of evil, nevertheless says this after a lot of it. He talks about the fact that some theologians think God can't suffer, and he says, I disagree. I think God can suffer, and he can suffer in proportion to his greatness. He says God was prepared to accept this suffering in order to overcome sin and death and the evils that afflict our world, and to confer on us a life more glorious than we can imagine, so we don't know why God permits evil. Notice that statement from somebody who's written about this more than most other people on the planet. We don't know why God permits evil. We do know, however, that he was prepared to suffer on our behalf, to accept suffering of which we can form no conception. So the message of Christmas, of God coming into the world, I think gives us a basis for trust in God. It shows us that God can bring good out of evil, and that God has this incredible purpose for us. But finally, I want to consider one further aspect of the Christmas story, and it's hope. Perhaps we can't explain suffering, we can't understand it, but can we have hope? Now, it's interesting in the context that Jesus came into the world in first century Palestine. People, the Jews, were looking for God to do something. They had been taken into exile. Back in the 6th century BC, Jerusalem had been defeated. They'd been taken into Babylon. They were allowed to come back to live in their own country under the Persians. They subsequently were under the rule of other nations, the Greeks and Egyptians, Syrians. There was a period when they freed themselves and had their own independence, but that didn't work out terribly well, and they ended up with the Romans in control. And at this time, when Jesus comes on the scene, they're looking for their freedom. Politically, religiously, culturally, they're under threat. And as far as they're concerned, they're still in exile. They might be back living in Jerusalem or there in the neighborhood, but they're still in exile. The prophecies of freedom and blessing that God had given still haven't been fulfilled. And so they're looking for something more. They're hoping for God to do something. They're expecting God to act, to restore their nation's fortunes, to defeat their enemies, to give them their independence, to rebuild the temple. They're looking for these prophecies to be fulfilled. Many of them expect a Messiah. Now, admittedly, they're looking for a Messiah who's going to come as a king and defeat the Romans. So here we see a people who were incredibly vulnerable because of the rule they were under. There was a huge amount of uncertainty and division. They had no control. They were filled with disappointment and unfulfilled hopes and expectations. Does that sound familiar? It sounds a little bit like the world of 2020, doesn't it? But into this world, Jesus came. The prophet Isaiah had said that the people walking in darkness have seen a great light, and those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. And so we might have hope because of the vaccine, but this has raised questions that go beyond just COVID-19. It's raised questions about our purpose, about meaning, and about our mortality. So where ultimately are we to find hope? You see, evil and suffering present a challenge for every worldview. Whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Muslim, a Buddhist, whether you're an atheist, where are we going to get hope? And I would say that ultimately, atheism provides us with no hope. Suffering is still there. But in Christianity, because of the God who comes among us, we have a basis for hope. So where is God in COVID-19? Well, I would say that God is here. God is with us. And whatever you've gone through, He's with you in your suffering. He's with you in your weeping, in your mourning. He's with us in our fight against this virus. And what He's hoping is that we will reach out to find Him and find the purpose for which He created us. I think one of the ironies is that very often we treat God, even if we believe in the God of the Bible, we treat Him as if He was remote, distant, out there somewhere. And so He's at best peripheral sometimes in our lives. But He wants to draw near to us, and He wants us to draw near to Him. One of my favorite Christmas carols is O Little Town of Bethlehem. And it says, O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by. Yet in thy dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. So when Jesus came at Christmas, He didn't come in the way many people had expected. The world seemed to be continuing as normal. And yet in this little village, the hopes and fears of all the years, even 2020, were met that night.
Well, I just want to thank David for sharing with us tonight. We're going to let him have a couple of minutes to catch his breath, and then Johnny will put some of your questions to him. If you haven't submitted a question yet and you would like to do so, then please use the question and answer box on the bottom or top of your screen to ask your question, and we'll try and get through as many of those as possible. Thank you to those who have already submitted some questions for us to get going with. At the beginning of the evening, Johnny made you aware of a couple of polls and said we'd share the results of these with you. And we're going to do that now, really just to let you see what everyone you're watching with is dealing with and maybe where they're at too. So do take time to read these results as they have come up. So how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected you? Just to remind you, this was multiple choice, so you could select more than one answer for these, and quite a large proportion of you either have contracted COVID-19 or know someone that has, and many other of you have experienced separation from loved ones, feelings of loneliness and isolation, feelings of anxiety and fear. The second poll we asked was, do you believe in the existence of God? And it was just a simple yes, no result here. And for everyone watching, they do believe in the existence of God. Part of the reason that we wanted to run this event was because we know that the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted so many people, either directly or indirectly. We are all going through a collective suffering, and so it is our hope and prayer that, as David has shared tonight, it will have helped you to think through some of the big questions. We're going to go back to Johnny now, and he will put some of your questions to David.
Thanks very much, April. Yeah, we have some questions that have come through here, David, so I'll try and pose some of them to you now. There's a couple of themes emerging here. The first one, not surprisingly, is this theme of blaming God. And really, are we right to blame God? Have we got this out of perspective? Or are we almost treating COVID-19 or viewing it in a way differently than other struggles? So the question was, do you think the coronavirus has been exaggerated? Not to say that it isn't real, but there are greater and more severe problems in the world like hunger, cancer, abortion. Therefore, God always is moving and working. Why should COVID really question our perspective on God more than those other things?
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you for the question, and I think this is a really important question, and I think the point about whether it should question our perspective more than other cases of pain and suffering. I don't think it should necessarily. I think that's right. So I'm not in any way saying that COVID is worse than the other things that are mentioned, cancers and so forth. Certainly not. All types of suffering can raise the same problem, the same question. And I suppose it's just the scale of this worldwide, the impact that it's had is huge. And so sometimes I think what can happen in the context of suffering, and I talked earlier about these different problems of suffering, the intellectual on the one hand and the emotional or experiential problem. And one of the things is that unless we're experiencing something, it's very often we can be very detached from it. But I think as the survey shows here tonight, all of us at some level have experienced the challenge of COVID-19. And it throws up a range of issues, not just for the individual. Now, for the individual, whatever they're suffering from is absolutely key. But this throws up issues for society, about our vulnerability as a society and so on. So I think it brings up perhaps different dimensions, but not in a way that is more serious than other types of suffering.
Yeah, I guess often when we're going through suffering, we can at times feel isolated, like we're the only people going through that experience, whereas this has been a collective suffering that in many senses is almost exposed just as much about us as it has about these big questions that have always been around.
Absolutely,
yeah. Just another one here about explaining evil. Is evil not a result of man's own sinfulness? Why do you think God gets blamed?
Yeah, well, also a very good question. So the question is, I suppose, can we just say that all instances of suffering are due to our sinful nature? Now, I think the questioner is perhaps taking the second of those views that I adopted towards natural disasters. And at one level, as a Christian, I want to say, yes, that's partly right, isn't it? That the suffering that we experience in the world, the evil that we see, is in large measure the result of human sinful activity. But it raises this further question. Well, why does God allow this particular suffering as a result of sinful human activity? Why does he not allow there just to be a smaller amount of suffering in response to human sinful activity? But of course, that raises all sorts of questions as well, because it highlights, I suppose, the seriousness of human sin. So I think it's definitely part of the answer, but I suppose, as I was suggesting in the talk, I think I don't think it fully satisfies it. It's not as if we can say, well, it's due to human sinfulness and that explains it, and that's the problem addressed. It still leaves this question, well, why? And why is it sometimes, and the Psalms ask this sort of question, don't they, about why the righteous suffer? Why does God allow the wicked to prosper, for example? And so it raises the same type of question raises in a variety of contexts.
I guess the encouragement that I get from the Psalms is that it does ask those questions. It's okay to ask those questions. Just flipping it on its head here, to turn the question of suffering on its head, says this person, where is God where we find love or kindness involved?
Yes, well, that's a very good point, isn't it? And I think what I want to say is that God is here. He's with us in our suffering. It's not his ideal plan for us and our world. This was not God's purpose. Something has gone wrong with the world. But equally, he is here with us in the acts of kindness and compassion as well. And indeed, that's what God is desiring. He is desiring that we can be transformed into his likeness so that we can carry out those acts of kindness and compassion as part of his kingdom. This is what Jesus is doing. People wanted Jesus or a Messiah who would come along and set up some sort of political kingdom and defeat the Romans, but Jesus was after something very different. He was trying to establish, and he talks a lot about God's kingdom. And when we go and read his Sermon on the Mount, we see that this is the basis for love and compassion and justice and so forth. All of these things find their basis in God, in God's character. So these very definitely are a reflection of a good and loving God.
One more just on the whole theme of good and evil. We said at the beginning of this discussion that obviously people are coming looking at this through different lenses, and here's an example of that. If evolution and atheism is true, then how would you account for evil?
I think that is a very interesting one to explore. And I think at one level, the answer is very easily. If atheism is true, and let's set aside questions about evolution and science and all that sort of thing. But if atheism is true, if ultimately there is no purpose behind everything, if everything has come about by evolutionary mechanisms and ultimately chance processes with no purpose or no design behind it, then there really is no purpose. There is no meaning. There is no, as Richard Dawkins says, no good or evil. Suffering just happens. He says some people are going to get lucky. Some people are going to get hurt, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it. So at one level, it does explain it, but it just raises a whole host of other questions. Is there really nothing more to it? Is there no meaning or purpose or significance? Is there no rhyme or reason? No purpose behind it all? And I suppose ultimately the big one is hope. Even if it can explain suffering, it still leaves us with this question, well, the suffering is still there. It's a reality. And what hope ultimately is there? And I don't think atheism provides us with that with the hope. In fact, I think it's only in this message we've been talking about a God who comes into the world and demonstrates his love, that we find this basis for hope.
You've kind of just answered one of the other questions I was going to throw at you there about hope. What do you say to those who strive to find hope in their humanity, in other words, within themselves, rather than hope in God?
Yeah, well, I think hope is such an important issue, and it's central to Christianity. I think, we talk about faith, hope, and love. And we talk in Christian circles a lot about faith and love, but maybe not so much about hope. But I think hope is extremely important. Now, there is a kind of hope that we can have that is based on our own decisions, our own plans, our own desires, on the things that we as humans achieve. So when we talk about the vaccine, for example, this gives us great hope. And this is amazing what has been achieved to get these vaccines. And so they provide hope. And we can also be hopeful in ourselves about our future. Maybe in the face of suffering, we can have a positive disposition and try to be hopeful. But I think when Christianity is talking about hope, it's talking about hope that is rooted in something objective. It's not merely a positive attitude, hoping for something that probably won't come about. It's hoping for something based on what God has promised. And I think this is the key thing about Christian hope, that this is not just a hope for the short term. And it's not a hope based on just our wishes and desires. It's a hope based on the reality of the way things are, indeed on the creator of the universe.
Here's one very much within your field that you love to talk about. Science is often explained as the reason to forget about God. What would be your best examples of science actually pointing us towards God?
That's a very dangerous question to ask at this time of the evening when we should be finishing soon, because that would be a whole other talk. I think one of the things that I would say is science itself. There are many particular findings within science that I do think point in the direction of a creator. And all of those are controversial and would require detailed discussion and explanation. But the very possibility of science itself, I think, points in the direction of God. This is certainly what the early scientists thought. Sometimes we think of science along these lines, that you had some genius like Newton who discovered these laws, the law of gravitation and so forth. And this is what brought about the scientific revolution. It was a discovery of these laws. But one historian of science, formerly a professor at Oxford, Peter Harrison, he says that one of the key driving factors in the development of modern science was not the discovery of laws, but the idea that there were laws to be discovered. And so you find that many of these early scientists started looking for laws in nature. Why? Because they believed in a lawgiver. They believed in a rational creator, and so expected to find order in the universe. And so the very enterprise of science was based on this assumption that the universe is rational, is orderly, and that we as human beings, with our limited finite minds, nevertheless have at least some capacity to comprehend that order. And as one of them put it, in doing science, to think God's thoughts after him. So I think that's a great motivation for doing science, I would say. And so I think the whole scientific enterprise itself fits best within a worldview which includes belief in God.
Just to wrap up, really challenged by what you brought tonight, particularly when you talked to us about how we may not understand what God's doing in something like this pandemic, indeed in many of the things in our lives, but we can trust him. Let me just ask, just from your own perspective, your own faith perspective, what good do you think God could be bringing about even through the current pandemic that we're in?
Yeah. I think one of the things that we can look at is some of the things that I suppose, mentioned briefly that we see in the world as a result of COVID-19. I think it has raised a huge number of questions for us. And it has perhaps changed our attitudes in ways that I hope will continue. So we do have this awareness of our vulnerability. At times we might have thought that we were invincible. There was the idea that history was reaching its end. There was a book just a couple of years ago called Homo Deus, a secular writer basically saying, well, look, we're well on our way to defeating illness and to becoming almost godlike ourselves. And, our progress in medicine is such that we have defeated most of the illnesses and we're well on our way. Now, you think, well, what world is he looking at when we look at a lot of the problems we see? But it's very hard after COVID to think like that anymore, because we see how vulnerable we are. And we see the impact of this suffering. And I would hope that one of the good things that would come out of it would be that we would take a different perspective, that we would start to realize our own limitations, and what is needed to make the world a better place. And speaking from my own perspective as a Christian, I suppose then what I want to say is that I hope it will bring about a greater good, in the sense that we will perhaps start to ask these questions about our finitude, about our mortality, about our purpose in life. Because COVID-19 has really challenged that. What is our purpose? And so I hope that's one of the things that we will start to explore, and that there really is a purpose and meaning and fulfillment that we can find if we reach out to the God who has reached out to us.
Amen. Thanks very much, David. Really want to thank you for sharing with us tonight. Thank you for the time and preparation that you've put into this, and also the sensitivity that you've dealt with it in. Thank you very much. I want to thank a couple of other people as well. I want to thank Nigel and Robert, our technical team, who have kept us on the road here tonight, and thank April, my co-host, who has really coordinated this whole event and even got me using a tablet, which is a revolution in itself. Also want to thank all of you for tuning in, giving us your time, sending in your questions and participating in the polls. Obviously, the journey to faith and understanding the reality of who God is and what he's doing in this world is just that. It's a journey. And here at Green Island Baptist, we want to assist you in that journey any way we can. And so if you'd like to talk with us more, if maybe we could signpost you to some resources, perhaps you're wrestling with this subject or another subject, then feel free to just contact us, drop us an email at info@greenislandbaptist.com. We'd love to hear from you and be in touch with you. We'd also love to invite you to any of our events or services going on, and you can find out the information about those on our website at www.greenislandbaptist.com, or check out our Facebook, Instagram, or our YouTube channel. We are, of course, on the verge of Christmas, and I do in particular just want to highlight two events coming up. On December 20th, we've got our carol services. They're happening at 9:30 and 11 in the morning, and 6:30 and 8 in the evening, and you'd be very welcome to attend those services. Just go onto our website and you can register. And then also on Christmas Day, we've got a service at 11 o'clock. Again, registration information on the website. That's it for tonight from here at the church. I want to thank you for joining us and say good night and God bless you.